He is riding alone across a field. Behind him, 50,000 men are watching. Farmers, tilers, blacksmiths, priests, men who have walked from Kent and Essex and Surrey, who have not slept properly in 3 weeks, who have already done things that everyone told them were impossible. They took a castle. They took a city. Yesterday they made a king sign his name to pieces of parchment that abolished 600 years of English feudal law. Now their leader is riding toward that king, alone, across an open field at Smithfield, just north of London's walls. The king is 14 years old. He has brought a handful of knights. He is a boy in a crown, sitting on a horse, and he is badly outnumbered, and he has already given these men everything they asked for, which is why what happens next makes no sense, unless you understand what the Mayor of London has already decided, what the king already knows, and what the man riding forward does not. His name is Wat Tyler. He is a roof tiler from Kent. He has no political philosophy, no military training, no experience of courts or kings or the machinery of power. What he has is 3 weeks of proof that everything he was told about the natural order of things was wrong. Proof that peasants could march, that they could negotiate, that a king, if you brought enough people, would sit across from you and listen. He is riding toward Richard II at the absolute peak of his own power. Every demand he came here with, the abolition of serfdom, the end of the poll tax, free land for free men, has been granted. He is winning. William Walworth, the Mayor of London, is watching him ride forward. Walworth has already made his decision. The king knows it. The knights around the king know it. Every one of them watches their leader cross the field. None of them move to stop what is about to happen, because none of them know it is coming. He lost. He was killed in that field. His head was spiked. On London Bridge, his movement was crushed. Every promise broken. Hundreds of his followers executed. By any rational measure, the peasants' revolt of 1381 failed completely, and yet, the feudal system he was trying to destroy never recovered. Serfdom vanished from England within a generation. No parliament imposed a poll tax again for 600 years. The world he died trying to create came into existence anyway, just without him in it, and without anyone remembering his name clearly enough to credit him for it. The match that lit all of this was a shilling. That shilling had a history 30 years in the making. In 1348, the Black Death arrived on English shores. It killed, by the most reliable estimates, somewhere between a third and half of the entire population. Villages were emptied, fields went unworked, priests died faster than they could be replaced, and sometimes there was nobody left to perform last rites over the bodies that were piling up outside churchyard walls. The scale of it was so catastrophic that contemporaries genuinely believed the world was ending. Some of them were not wrong about that. They simply had the wrong world in mind, because what ended was not England. What ended was the labour surplus that had kept the feudal system working for 3 centuries. The arrangement had always been simple and brutal. Lords owned land. Peasants, serfs, villains, bound men worked it. They could not leave their manors without their lord's permission. They could not sell their labour to another master, could not choose their own crops, could not absent themselves even to find better wages elsewhere. They were not slaves in the Roman sense, but they were not free men either. They existed somewhere between, bound to the soil, bound to the Lord, bound to a structure that the church, the law, and every source of authority in their world told them God himself had ordained. When a third of the population died, that system ran headlong into a problem it could not solve by proclamation. There were not enough workers, not enough hands to bring in harvests that lords desperately needed, not enough serfs to fill the manorial obligation, and serfs, for the first time in English history, found that their labour was worth something. Suddenly lords were competing for workers. Men who had been bound to one manor for generations began drifting to another, where the lord was offering better terms, more food, fewer obligations. Wages that had been suppressed for generations began to rise. For about 3 years, the economic logic of the Black Death was quietly and irreversibly rewriting the social contract of England. Parliament ended that. In 1351, the Statute of Labourers was passed. It capped wages at pre-plague levels. It forbade peasants from leaving their manors. It made the labour mobility that had briefly and accidentally existed into a crime. Lords who had been quietly paying above rate to keep their workers were brought back into line. Peasants who had moved to find better terms were legally required to return. The leverage the plague had accidentally handed to the lowest people in English society was, by an act of law, taken away from them. It was not merely tradition or theology. When tradition started to crack under economic pressure, it was propped up by legislation. The whole structure was not natural. It required enforcement. The peasants of England noticed. What noticing looked like, in practice, was a serf who had walked to the next village to work for a lord offering better terms. Quietly, carefully, the way men do things they know are illegal, being reported by his original lord's reeve and fined back to his original manor. What it looked like was a harvest wage that had been 3 pence a day before the plague, that should by simple economics have been 5 or 6 pence after it, being held at 3 pence by a law that existed for no reason except to keep it there. What it looked like was 30 years of men doing the arithmetic on their own lives and reaching the same answer every time. For 30 years they lived under the statute of labourers, watching the gap between what their labour was worth and what they were actually paid grow wider. Watching lords invoke ancient manorial obligations that everyone knew were economically absurd. Watching priests collect tithes from men who could barely feed their children. The resentment that built in those 30 years was not revolutionary in any organised sense. There was no movement, no manifesto, no coordination. It was simply the slow, accumulating weight of people being told their situation was natural and godly when they could see perfectly well that it was neither. Then came the poll taxes. England was fighting a ruinously expensive war in France, and the royal treasury was empty. In 1377, the crown imposed a poll tax, a flat tax on every person in the kingdom. Then again in 1379. Then, in 1380, a third poll tax. And this one was the one that broke something. 1 shilling per person. Every adult in the kingdom, regardless of wealth. A lord with 1,000 acres and a serf with nothing paid the same amount. In a world of commodity money, 1 shilling represented roughly 2 or 3 days of a labourer's wages. It was not merely an insult, it was a calculation that revealed exactly what the government thought the poor were for. Resistance was immediate. Tax records from 1380 and 1381 show massive undercounting. Villages that had been assessed at hundreds of taxpayers suddenly reporting far fewer. People were hiding, moving, bribing collectors, simply refusing. The Crown's response was to send commissioners into the countryside to investigate the discrepancy and collect what was owed. In May 1381, one of those commissioners, Thomas Bampton, arrived in Fobbing, a village in Essex on the Thames estuary. He demanded payment from villagers who had evaded the count. The village of Fobbing told him no. When he tried to compel them, they drove him out. That was all it took. Within days, the revolt had spread through Essex. Within a week, it crossed into Kent. Men who had been quietly furious for 30 years discovered that the man in the next village was furious too, and that if you stopped pretending to be afraid of the same thing simultaneously, neither of you had to be afraid of it alone. What was building at the roadsides and commons of Kent and Essex that late May was not an army exactly. There was no chain of command, no supply line, no strategic objective in any military sense. It was something older than strategy, a great communal refusal, spreading from village to village like fire in dry grass. And the man who emerged to lead it out of that chaos was a roof tiler named Wat Tyler, whose life before June 1381 is so completely undocumented that historians cannot agree on which county he was born in or what his real name was. He was not a general. He was not a scholar. He was someone who could walk into a crowd of furious men and make them move in the same direction. In June of 1381, that turned out to be enough. The letters the revolt sent ahead of itself into the countryside simply said, "It is time." A village tax collector had been driven out of Essex 3 weeks ago. Now 50,000 men were 3 miles from the gates of London, and nobody inside those gates knew what was coming. Stick around until the end and subscribe if this is your kind of history. The first thing they took was a castle. Rochester Castle stood on the Medway in Kent, a Norman fortification, a symbol of exactly the kind of authority the rebels had decided to stop being afraid of. Tyler's men surrounded it on June 6, 1381. The garrison, staring out at numbers that must have seemed hallucinatory to them, surrendered. It was not the military triumph that mattered. It was the proof. A castle had fallen to men with scythes and hammers. The walls that separated the world of lords from the world of peasants were, it turned out, not entirely made of stone. From Rochester, the march turned south to Canterbury. The rebels entered the city on June 10th. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury, had already fled to London, but they freed John Ball from the Archbishop's prison, and that mattered more than the castle. Ball was a priest who had been preaching for 20 years that the structure of lord and serf was not God's plan, but man's convenience. He had been imprisoned, excommunicated, and banned repeatedly, and none of it had stopped him. His most famous line had become a kind of underground refrain across the English countryside. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? It was a theological question with a revolutionary answer. There had been no lords at the beginning. God had made men equal. Everything else was something other men had imposed, and other men could therefore remove. When they freed him from prison, they acquired something more than a preacher. They acquired a voice that could reach the thousands of men gathering around them and tell them that what they were doing was not sin, but justice. By June 12th, an army of somewhere between 30,000 and 60,000 people, estimates vary, and the medieval sources tend toward the dramatic, had gathered on Blackheath, the high ground south of London overlooking the Thames. They sent word to the king asking to meet. Richard, only 14 years old, initially agreed and sailed down the Thames by royal barge to hear their grievances. He took one look at the size of the army on the bank. The barge turned around. Jean Froissart, the Flemish chronicler who spent his career documenting the courts and wars of 14th century Europe, gathered his account from English court witnesses in the years that followed. His chronicles remain the most detailed contemporary record of the revolt, though Froissart's sympathies lay with the nobility, and his hostility to the rebels shapes what he chooses to notice and what he chooses to omit. He describes the scene at Blackheath with something that reads as barely suppressed horror. The rebels were orderly, which he clearly found more disturbing than if they had been chaotic. An orderly mob is a political movement. A chaotic one is merely a riot. That night and the next morning, June 13th, something happened that no one who governed England had imagined was possible. The gates of London Bridge opened from the inside. Someone let the rebels in, whether it was a sympathetic gatekeeper acting alone or a deliberate choice by London's poorer citizens to admit the army they had been watching gather across the river. The chronicle record is unclear. The rebels walked into London. What followed that afternoon was not random. The crowds attacked the Savoy Palace, the residence of John of Gaunt, the king's uncle, and the man most blamed for the poll tax regime. They burned it, systematically. Froissart records that when one of the rebels tried to steal silver from the wreckage, other rebels threw him into the fire with it. They were not here to loot, the logic ran. They were here to destroy what the Savoy represented. Then they burned the records of the Inns of Court, then the property of the Hospitallers. The targets were not random, they were institutional. On June 14th, Richard rode out to Mile End and did not turn back this time. He came with a small retinue. The crowd that met him was vast enough that the king's party was swallowed by it on three sides before they reached the meeting point. Richard was 14 years old, and he rode into that crowd without visible hesitation, which is either the behavior of a boy who had not fully understood what he was riding into, or the behavior of someone who had decided, before he left the tower, that the only move available to him was to ride forward and perform certainty until certainty became real. Tyler presented the demands: the abolition of serfdom, the freedom of villains, the end of the poll tax, the right to buy and sell land freely at 4p an acre, the removal of all restrictions on labour movement. Richard listened. Then he agreed to all of it. Scribes produced parchment. The negotiations that had taken generations of peasant suffering to make necessary were committed to writing in the space of an afternoon. In a field outside London, while the men who had marched for 3 weeks stood around the edges watching, the king set his seal to documents that promised, in writing, that the feudal bondage of the English peasantry was ended, that every serf in England was free. Some of the men wept. Some stood holding their charters and read them, or had them read aloud, over and over, as if repetition would make the words more real. Some began walking home immediately. They had what they came for. They had won. They had not won, but they did not know that yet. And for a few hours on the afternoon of June 14th, 1381, walking away from Mile End, with a royal seal in their hands, they had every reason to believe they had. Tyler had not gone to Mile End. He did not trust the king's promises. He was right not to. While Richard was in the field signing charters, Tyler and 30,000 men who shared his skepticism had gone somewhere else entirely. They had walked to the Tower of London. The Tower's garrison, like the one at Rochester, did not fight. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury, was inside. So was Robert Hales, the treasurer, the man who had actually administered the poll tax. The rebels dragged both men out and beheaded them on Tower Hill. Sudbury's head was displayed on London Bridge, with his archbishop's mitre nailed to his skull. The men who died that afternoon were not abstract symbols. Sudbury had also been trying to negotiate. But for the men who killed him, the distinction between the man and what he represented had collapsed entirely. He was the poll tax made flesh. He was 30 years of the statute of labourers given a face. What happened to him on Tower Hill was not justice in any legal sense. It was the arithmetic of accumulated grievance finally finding a specific target. Tyler and those who had stayed in London now had 30,000 armed men still in the city, a king who had signed charters whose ink was barely dry, and a mayor who had looked at everything that had happened in the past 48 hours and reached a very particular conclusion. The king proposed one final meeting, Smithfield. The next morning, Tyler agreed. He rode out. The morning came in flat across the fields north of the city walls, and the army came with him. The men who had walked from Kent and Essex, who had taken a castle and burned a palace and made a king negotiate in an open field. Richard and his retinue waited on the opposite side of the open ground. Between them was maybe 200 yards of open field, and across it, everything that had happened in the previous 3 weeks was about to be decided in a matter of minutes. Froissart's account of Smithfield is the most detailed we have, and it needs to be read with one hand on his sympathies at all times. He was writing for noble audiences who had found the whole episode mortifying, and his Tyler is arrogant, threatening, almost looking for a confrontation. Strip that framing away and what remains is still remarkable. A roof Tyler from Kent rode alone toward the King of England and began negotiating. His demands at Smithfield had moved beyond what he had asked for at Mile End. The abolition of serfdom had been granted. Now he wanted the abolition of lordship itself, church wealth to be redistributed to the poor, all men to be equal before the law, with only the king above them. No more bishops, no more lords, no more of the entire intermediate structure of power that sat between the crown and the commons and extracted everything from the people at the bottom. These were not the demands of a man who wanted minor reforms to an existing system. They were the demands of a man who had looked at the entire architecture of medieval England and concluded that the building needed to come down. Whether he actually believed he could get Richard to agree to this, whether any of this was serious negotiation or a kind of declaration, is a question the sources cannot answer. But he rode forward alone into that gap between the armies, and he talked. What that gap looked like from inside it is something the sources can only partially reconstruct. Froissart says his horse's head was nearly touching the king's horse, close enough that Richard could hear him without either man needing to raise a voice, close enough that the men on both sides of the field could watch two figures talking without hearing a word. The rebel army behind him was silent. The king's retinue was still. Everything that was happening in that 200 yards of open ground was happening between two horses, in lowered voices, between a boy who had been raised to rule and a man who had never been told he couldn't. He asked for water. This much the sources agree on. What they disagree about is what it meant. Froissart reads it as deliberate disrespect, the action of a man who wanted to provoke. Other accounts suggest it was nothing more than a man who had been awake since before dawn, asking for something to drink. What is certain is that the request was noted. Everything he did in those minutes was noted, evaluated, assigned meaning by men who had already decided what they thought of him. What followed in the next seconds is disputed. A man in the king's party shouted something, an accusation, an insult. the specific content varying across accounts. He responded, or reached for something, or made a movement that was read as a threat. Walworth saw it, or decided to see it. William Walworth, the Mayor of London, drew a weapon and stabbed. Wat Tyler? He did not die immediately. He managed to pull his horse around and ride back toward his own lines. Froissart says he made it perhaps 20 yards before he fell from the saddle. 20 yards. In the time it takes a wounded man on a horse to cover 20 yards, the entire balance of what was happening at Smithfield shifted. The men closest to him saw him fall first. Then the men behind them saw the horse without a rider. Then the word moved back through the crowd. Not shouted, not announced, but passed from man to man in the way catastrophic news moves through a body of people. The information arriving a fraction of a second before the understanding of what it meant. 50,000 men saw their leader fall. The silence that followed was not complete. There was the sound of horses, the wind across the open field, the distant noise of the city, but the specific noise of an army that has been moving and talking and existing as a coordinated body for 3 weeks. That stopped. In that stillness, the archers in the rebel army raised their bows. What the king's retinue saw from across the field was the front rank of the rebel army drawing on them. Several hundred bows. More than enough. There were no reinforcements close enough to matter. The king's handful of knights could not fight their way out of this. The next 30 seconds belonged to Richard II. He spurred his horse forward, alone. He rode toward the rebel army, toward the raised bows, and he was 14 years old, and he did not stop. The men with drawn bows watched a boy on a horse ride toward them, and watched him not stop, and something in that specific action, the not stopping, created a hesitation that nothing else could have produced. He called out to them. His own captain's accounts suggest he said something to the effect that he would be their king and their leader, that Tyler was a traitor, but their grievances were just, and they should follow him. He was making promises. He had already broken once, and would break again. He was performing royal authority in front of an army that had every reason to disbelieve it, but he was also 14 years old, riding alone toward drawn bows, and not stopping. It was either a moment of extraordinary personal courage, or a piece of cold political calculation by a boy who had been raised since birth to project royal authority and understood, in this moment, that authority was the only weapon he had that could work. The sources do not tell us which. The rebels hesitated, and in that hesitation, the revolt ended. Walworth had ridden back to the city during those few minutes and raised an armed force from the city militias. By the time the rebel army had been talked into withdrawing toward the open fields north of Smithfield, several hundred armed men were moving to surround them. The moment had passed. The bows came down. The rebels dispersed. Tyler, who had not died from the stab wound, not yet, had been carried to the nearby hospital of St. Bartholomew's, which stood at the edge of the Smithfield grounds. Walworth followed him there. He dragged Tyler out and had him beheaded in the street in front of the hospital. His head replaced Sudbury's on London Bridge. John Ball was captured in the days that followed. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered at St. Albans on July 15th in front of the king. He refused to recant. The accounts suggest he said, at the end, that he was glad to suffer for truth. Across England in the weeks that followed, the reprisals moved through the countryside with the efficiency of authority that has been badly frightened and is now making very sure it does not happen again. Hundreds of rebels were executed. Richard revoked every charter he had signed at Mile End. The abolition of serfdom was declared null and void. The promises lasted 18 days. At a parliament convened in November 1381, the king was asked by some of his lords to address the grievances that had caused the revolt, to offer some concession, some partial acknowledgement that there had been legitimate complaint underneath the violence. Richard refused. The villains of England had no right to raise grievances, he said. The status quo would be maintained by force if necessary. He meant it. The army of enforcement was already in the field. Something had happened that no proclamation could unhappen. The crack was already in the wall. The reprisals were meant to close it. The heads on bridges were meant to teach a lesson, and they did. But not the lesson the Crown intended. What the executions of 1381 taught every serf in England was not that resistance was futile. What they taught was that resistance was possible. An army of farmers had marched on London. They had taken a castle, burned a palace, stormed the tower, made a king negotiate in an open field. They had been crushed, but crushed implies they were irrelevant, and they were not. Everyone in England now knew what could be done. The knowing could not be undone. In the years and decades that followed, no great revolt swept England again on the same scale, but something quieter happened, and it was ultimately more decisive than any march on London. The labour shortage the Black Death had created in 1348 had not gone away. It was still there. Serfs who could not legally leave their manors began leaving anyway. Lords who could not afford to lose their workers began negotiating. Manorial obligations that had been legally enforceable began being quietly dropped, because the alternative was watching your fields go unworked. Richard did not escape consequence either, though his took longer to arrive. The boy who had ridden toward drawn bows at Smithfield and watched an army put its weapons down grew into a king who became increasingly convinced of his own divine authority, as if that day had proved something to him about the power of performed certainty that he never quite recovered from. In 1399, 18 years after Smithfield, Henry Bolingbroke deposed him. Richard was imprisoned in Pontefract Castle and died there the following year. The manner of his death is disputed: starvation, murder, grief, but the outcome is not. He was 33 years old. The king who had defeated Wat Tyler outlived him by less than 2 decades and spent the last of them in a cell, which is not exactly justice, but is the kind of thing that happens when you ride toward 50,000 archers and spend the rest of your life believing the trick will always work. The Statute of Labourers remained on the books. It simply became progressively less enforceable. By the middle of the 15th century, serfdom, the condition of being legally bound to the land, of being a villain under the ancient manorial law that Tyler had died trying to abolish, had effectively ceased to exist in England. Not because Parliament passed a law, not because any king made a proclamation. It vanished because the economic reality of post-plague England made it unworkable, and because the psychological reality of post-1381 England made its enforcement something lords could no longer count on with the certainty they once had. Tyler did not cause this. The Black Death caused this, set in motion decades before he was born, and the process would have continued with or without the revolt of 1381, and he was essential to it. Both of those things were true simultaneously. What he and the men who marched with him did was prove that the people at the bottom of the system would not simply absorb whatever was imposed on them. They proved that the ideology underneath feudalism, the theology that said the order was permanent because God had made it so, was a story that could be disbelieved. The moment an army of farmers made a king negotiate, the story lost its grip. Not for everyone, and not immediately, but enough, and permanently enough, that the English ruling class never again tried to simply reassert it. Without calculating the cost, Jean Froissart, writing his account of the revolt in the years after 1381, mourned it from the perspective of the nobility he served. He described the rebels with contempt barely disguised as observation. Froissart's account of the Smithfield meeting reserves its most precise language for the details of Tyler's rudeness, his failure to remove his cap, his tone with the king, as if the correct etiquette of a man about to be killed was the most important thing to record. He was confident that the proper order had been restored. He was correct about the short term. He had no way of knowing that the world he was describing, the world of manorial obligation and bound labour and the God-ordained permanence of the order, was already in the process of ending, and that the men he was writing about with contempt had been the ones who first pushed it. The poll tax, the specific instrument that had lit the fuse, was not tried again. For 600 years, English governments remembered what had happened the last time and decided against it. 600 years is a long institutional memory. The lesson became embedded in political instinct so deep, it did not need to be consciously recalled. It simply never came up again as a serious proposal, for generation after generation, for 6 centuries, until 1989. Margaret Thatcher's government introduced the community charge, a local government tax charged at a flat rate per adult, regardless of income or wealth. It was called the poll tax from the moment it was proposed. Riots broke out across England. A demonstration in London in March 1990 turned into the most violent civil disorder the capital had seen in modern times. Thatcher was forced from office in November 1990. Her successor abolished the community charge, the poll tax was repealed. His name appeared on placards in Trafalgar Square that year, 6 centuries after his death, which is one way of measuring how far a roof tiler from Kent had travelled. If Tyler had survived Smithfield, if Walworth's blade had missed, if Richard's gamble had failed and the rebel army had held their ground, would serfdom have ended faster or slower? A surviving Tyler might have forced genuine concessions at the peak of his leverage, or he might have given the crown the emergency it needed to mobilize the full weight of military force and crush the movement far more completely than the half-hearted reprisals of 1381 actually did. The world he died trying to create came into being without him. Whether it would have arrived sooner or later with him alive is the question history refused to answer. The feudal system did not fall because of Wat Tyler. It fell because of economics and plague and time. But the ideology that made it seem permanent and divinely ordained fell, at least in part, because a man who tiled roofs for a living rode into a field and made a king listen. And even though that man was killed 30 seconds later, even though his promises were broken and his followers were hunted and his movement was crushed, even though his head spent the rest of that summer rotting on London Bridge, the moment had happened. Everyone had seen it. He rode alone toward the king at Smithfield and did not come back. The poll tax did not come back either, not for 600 years. And when it finally did, the answer was the same. Was Tyler's death the thing that let his ideas survive, by making him a memory instead of a man who could be compromised or co-opted? Or did the movement die at Smithfield in a way that set the timeline of English freedom back by a generation? Leave your answer in the comments. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories like this one.